if you look around the world, and the big difference between the United States and many other nations is just that our economy has been so much stronger. Europe went through, the European Union went through significant Eurozone, a significant period of very, very low growth, while we were growing, 3% plus last year. So we're in a different place. And I mean, actually, what's more remarkable about the current situation is how much there is in common between what happened. The global inflation broke out everywhere. Central banks did kind of very similar things. There's little differences in timing in terms of starting to loosen policy, but really the era, I think, will be known much more for its commonalities than it is for its differences like this.
So when the FOMC makes a decision, let's say to increase rates or lower rates, they finish their final meeting, you are authorized then to go out and explain what it is. How long before, after the meeting ends, before you go out and publicly explain it? Is it 20 minutes or so?
It's 3 or 4 hours usually.
3 or 4 hours?
Yes, because the meeting might end at, I'm out at 2:30 p.m. That's when the press conference starts at 2:30. So I'm usually the meeting's over by 11.
And you don't worry that things will leak out in that interim period of time, I assume?
No, I don't.
Okay.
People know better than that, I think. And
so in some parts of the society these days, people are making decisions based on something called artificial intelligence, AI. Have you thought about, calling up ChatGPT and saying, here's all the data we have. What do you think about would be a good idea? Have you ever thought about that, or they're not going to like you to do that?
We haven't done that. I mean, we have done little things like we've asked ChatGPT to generate questions for the press conference. Oh. And I'm happy to report for any journalists who are here that the questions were not as good as the ones we get from real journalists. So,
what about my questions? How do they compare to my questions? Okay, no comment. Right, so they weren't that great. Okay. So today, at the Federal Reserve Board, you are not involved in picking anybody who's on the Federal Reserve Board. The president makes those decisions. Do they ever call you for advice on who you might pick or they might pick?
It has happened, but it's, I would say, not the norm now.
Okay.
The Reserve Bank presidents are different. We play a role with the search committees from the Reserve Banks on that.
So every summer, there's a meeting of the Federal Reserve people out in Jackson Hole. What do you all do out there? I mean, I always wonder, you wear cowboy boy boots, you go on ride horses. What do you all do? Why do you need to go to Jackson Hole? Why not go to, someplace closer than to Washington, D.C., Baltimore like?
Cowboy boots are worn by some, but not all. I don't wear them myself. But it's what it is. It's an academic conference. So the Kansas City Fed, which puts this on, they'll pick a topic, and then they'll find, really top economists to write papers about that topic or more than one topic. You come to Jackson Hole, they present their paper, people critique it, they praise it, and that kind of thing. And that's the mornings. And in the afternoon, people go take a hike. And let me be clear, this is not a rate hike. It's an actual physical hike.
But you usually make a speech out there, I think.
Yes. That's traditionally, not every. I've done this every year, but not every Fed chair has done it every year. But I give the opening speech, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with the topic of the conference. I just give a speech. And
is it carefully worked on by the staff? You make sure you say something that sounds interesting, but you don't make any news?
No, actually. So I try to do. Typically, what I do is I talk about it's really focused on the economic outlook and that kind of thing at any given point in time. At Jackson Hole, I've tried to take a step back or move to a higher level and try to say things that have a little more generality to them and see what can we learn, for example.
Now, the Federal Reserve is over 100 years old. It was created under Woodrow Wilson. If you were around then, what would you have suggested they do better than they did in creating the system? Or do you think the system works pretty well after 100 years and you wouldn't change it very much?
So I'm giving myself perfect hindsight here. I would do what Congress did in 1933. So the original Fed didn't have an FOMC, and it really didn't function very well during the early parts of the Depression or during other. So in 1933, the current structure was put in place, and that's with the FOMC, with the number of governors and the voting arrangements. And I think that arrangement is fine. It works really well. In the 70s, the dual mandate was added But ultimately, we're not looking for any law change. We think we have the authorities that we need. We think that the law is in just a fine place.
Okay? So basically, you think the system works reasonably well
I do.
as it is today. And today, what is the biggest economic challenge you think facing the country? Is it growth? Is it inflation? Hard landing potentially? Or what are you most worried about? What keeps you up at night, if anything, in the economy?
So I'll say in the short term, that's what keeps me up. Like literally, the thing I'm thinking about in the middle of the night is always this balance we have between not wanting to, if we ease too early, we can undermine the progress on inflation. And if we wait too late, we can undermine economic activity. We can undermine the expansion. And, so we want to get this right. And getting it right is incredibly important for the people we serve. So that is really, that's what I spend a lot of my, thinking time on. Longer term, there are lots of things to worry about, but that's really what keeps me
most
up.
people, they have dinner with friends or sometimes. How can you have dinner with friends without hinting at what you're thinking about? And do you ever get suggestions from your friends at dinner, this is what you should do? And how do you respond when they kind of say, maybe you should lower interest rates? You just keep eating or what?
You might define the word friend to mean doesn't ask you about interest rates. So, no, people don't do that generally. People I don't know will always say, hey, cut rates. Somebody said that in the elevator this morning.
Did that influence you or no?
I said, thank you, sir. No, but I mean, people say things, but it's fine.
Okay, so today, for somebody that would like to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in the future, is it a job you would recommend to your best friend or your best enemy?
I think it's a great job. I think, again, the last thing Chairman Bernanke said to me as he was that day, I went to see him that day, his last day at the Fed, he said, you learn so much at the Fed. And remember, Ben Bernanke was a top 5 monetary economist in the world when he arrived at the Fed. So he learned a lot at the Fed. So can you imagine how much I've learned, starting? So it's never felt like work. It's so interesting all the time. And also, the dedication of the people who work there, 90, and the staff, these are people who have chosen a life of not being in the public spotlight. They just want to do their work and serve the public, and they're very dedicated. It's a wonderful place, and I would recommend the job.
So the Fed is also responsible for the way the Fed is set up. You're worried about a stable currency, I assume, and stable, well, not currency. You're worried about, I guess,
Stable prices.
inflation.
Yeah.
And you're worried about unemployment, but you have you don't make any decisions about what the impact is going to be on the currency or the dollar. In other words, the impact of what you decide to do on the dollar is not something you're mandated to worry about. Is that right?
That's right. The administration has that portfolio, the management of the dollar, for what that is. It used to be something different than what it is now. But for us, the effects of the things that we do or don't do on the dollar are just another financial variable like equity prices or things like that.
But if you worry about inflation, as you obviously are, what about the debt the United States has? We have $35 trillion of outstanding in government indebtedness, and we're adding about $1.6 to $2 trillion more or less every year. Aren't you worried about that on the impact of the economy on inflation?
So I am very worried over time about the deficits that we're running. It's not the Fed's job. We don't give Congress advice, but let me just say that we're on an unsustainable path. That doesn't mean that the level of debt we have is unsustainable. It's not. But the path we're on, where we're running, large deficits at a time of full employment and healthy growth, is not a sustainable one over time. And we really need to get to work on that. I would hope this is a top line issue for elected people whose job it is not our job. And I believe that if I do talk to quite a few elected officials in Congress, and I think there is a rising sense that it's time to do something about that. And it will take bipartisan action to address.
Let me ask you, in dealing with Congress, you testify, I think at least twice a year before members of Congress. You do the House side and the Senate side. Have you ever suggested them having a joint committee so you don't have to say the same thing twice, or they don't like that?
This is in the law. It's twice in February and twice in July, so it's 4 times a year. This is the Humphrey Hawkins put that in, and it's a tradition. And so the Senate went first last week. The House went first in this March, so they alternate. I think it would take, I don't know what it would take.
Do you get a lot of questions from members that you think are really adding a lot of good advice to you? Or
I think the members ask excellent questions. Yes, thank you for asking. They do. I'm generally very much pleased.
Well, you spend a fair amount of time with members of Congress compared to some of your predecessors. Is that because you think that they add a lot of value, or you just think it's a good courtesy to do that?
I think it's part of our job. You know, in our system of government, it is the legislature that has oversight over the Fed. It's not the executive branch. In a parliamentary system, they're sort of one and the same. So it's the two committees. And so I spend a great deal of time up on the Hill talking to people in both political parties, House and Senate, just finding out what's on their mind and really trying to take on board their thoughts on the economy and on what we're doing. And I think they appreciate that. And I think that to me is really a big part of this job.
The Fed depends on data, but how good is the Fed data collection efforts? In other words, are you using the same data collection methods you used 20, 30 years ago, or do you, because of technology, you have better data collection methods than before? And are you convinced you have data that's as good as the private sector has?
Most of the data that we get is the same that everybody else gets. The unemployment data, the inflation data, not collected by the Fed. We do some data collection, and we've actually been, dabbling in big data efforts for more than a decade. So I think we're very focused on the quality of data and collecting different kinds of economic data. During the pandemic, of course, it became necessary to do all kinds of, find all sorts of, different sorts of data to reflect what was going on in the economy. We did a lot of that too.
So when you became the chair of the Fed, what was the best advice somebody gave you who was a previous chair of the Fed?
What comes to mind, I can't think of one thing. I thought that what Chairman Greenspan said was get a set of earmuffs.
And when you eventually are not the chair of the Fed and somebody succeeds you, what would be the advice you would give them about how to be a good chair of the Fed?
To me, I think it's a very special American institution. And it's one that works to serve all Americans. And absolutely critical to that is staying in our lane, sticking to our knitting, not, running to reach out to the big hot political issues of the day. And I think that's critical because once you do that, if that's going to be what you do, what's the case for your independence? Congress has given us these powers. They've left us alone to do it. And really, we need to do those things and resist the temptation to expand that mandate. That's what I probably will say to my successor.
And when you want to go out to, let's have a dinner in a restaurant, do you worry that people are listening to what you're saying, they're eavesdropping, or you don't say anything that anybody has to make you worry about?
So that is exactly what I worry about. I have found that I get recognized now, and people at the next table are always listening. So we don't really go to restaurants.
So what do? You just go in a private room, or you don't go to restaurants?
If you're at a restaurant, you need to be in a private room because, of course, the people and by the way, if someone at your table were to be well served and start to speak loudly, everyone's hearing that too. So you got to be. We just don't do that for now. We go to we eat at home a lot. We eat at friends' houses.
Okay. Well, your wife is here. Where is she? She's right there. How long have you been married now?
15. Oh, 39 years.
39. You had to add that up.
Do the arithmetic, yeah.
39 years. And you have how many children?
3 children.
And any grandchildren?
We have 3 grandchildren, 3 little boys, the oldest of whom is 3, and all in the same family. So this is going to be quite a little place to visit.
Okay. Well, look, we've known each other a long time. I congratulate you on doing a great job at the Fed and avoiding the hard landing. And thanks for earlier telling me when you're going to lower interest rates in our private meeting. I now know when interest rates are going to go down. No, actually, that's not true.
You said you wouldn't tell anyone.
Right. Okay. Of course. Jay, thanks for a great job you're doing for the country.
Thank you, David.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell sitting down with our very own David Rubenstein at the Economic Club of Washington. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are broadcasting to you live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. Joe, we are expecting to hear a great deal of policy at the RNC this week, including on economic policy. Yep. And interesting to hear from Chairman Powell about not just the nature of where interest rates are going and how confident he is in the inflation data we're seeing, but also speaking of things like the deficit and the independence of the Fed.
The independence of the Fed and I guess the non-political nature of the Fed. Yes. So many questions about whether September is in play here. Kaylee, pretty interesting conversation in a way that only David Rubenstein could bring to us. And I will note here, as we take a look at the markets, Kaylee, the theme of this first day of the Republican National Convention is the economy. Mm-hmm. And that is what we're going to be hearing lawmakers and other dignitaries speaking to later on today.
Yeah, and of course, as you mentioned, checking out the markets here, the S&P 500 up about 0.4% off on the day. We're off session highs, but still we're looking at records here. We're up about the same amount on the NASDAQ 100 and the Dow. Interesting to see the bond market not reacting too much. Though if you look at that sensitive two-year yield to Fed policy, we were actually down on the day by a couple of basis points. Now we're exactly even. The two-year at 4.45 at the moment. The 10-year yield is up by about 5 basis points. We're looking at about 4.23 there. Of course, when you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve, what you are often trying to do is make sure that you do not move the markets and break any news. But let's see if we did get any new information from the Fed chairman and bring in Bloomberg's Michael McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, we did hear from Powell there talking about the idea that, yes, there was more confidence given to the Fed by the second quarter inflation data, if not the first. What does that mean as we look ahead to September?
Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot right now, but it does suggest that the Fed's getting closer to a rate cut. Powell seemed relatively confident about the progress that they have made. He noted that the last three inflation readings, including the most recent CPI, have been encouraging, but he didn't want to go as far as saying, this gives us the confidence we need to cut. And then he went on to say, I'm not going to give any hints about policy at future meetings today. So basically, he's leaving his options open, but it does kind of take July off the table in the sense that the Fed doesn't like to surprise markets. So the idea that he would, at this point, cut rates without already starting to hint at it. He didn't do that. So it probably means they're not going to do something in July. What's interesting, though, and you can see it there, is the measure of September rate cut, which had been priced in earlier today, is now priced out slightly at 96 basis points. It would be 100 basis points for one cut. So markets are taking a sort of pessimistic view of this in general, although I guess some areas of the stock market are starting to price in the idea of a rate cut.
Well, it's interesting, Michael, the headline, we don't put political filters on our decisions. Wasn't that the chairman's way of saying that September is in play?
Yeah, it's a way of saying September is in play. It's the same answer that he and every other member of the Open Market Committee give when asked, because a lot of people are looking at the calendar saying September 18th is pretty close to Election Day. There's no other meeting before Election Day, so they could cut rates then, which might be seen as an effort to help the incumbent. And the Fed has always argued that they don't do that, and history has shown that they don't let politics interfere. I think more important to the Fed is the idea that there are members of the party that is meeting in Milwaukee who have suggested changes to the Fed's mandates, and they are concerned about that. They don't want anybody to open up the Federal Reserve Act because all sorts of bad things could happen in terms of Fed independence.
Well, and that is kind of what we heard from the chairman at the end there, Mike. He talked about Fed independence and the idea that if he were to give advice to his successor, that they should not risk the temptation around expanding the mandate, which of course right now is just maximum employment and a 2% inflation target. As we think about the balance between those two sides of the mandate, though, hearing the chairman talking about the labor market there, is it now more really about the jobs picture than about the inflation picture, given where inflation levels have been able to come down to, even though we're not yet at 2%?
Well, it is to the extent that we see inflation continue to move down. Of course, any upward surprise would change the calculation. But right now, they are keeping an eye on the unemployment rate because it has risen. We're at 4.1%, which is where they thought we'd be at the end of the year. So if it goes significantly higher, that might pull forward a rate cut, make September definite, make July a possibility. We'll get the first week of August, the July unemployment figures. So that's something to keep an eye on. But his view was today, as it has been all this month in his various appearances, that unemployment and inflation are pretty much in balance now. They're positioned to move either way, depending on which one moves. But it's no longer that the unemployment rate is too low and that we have a very tight labor market that's pushing up inflation. So that's an encouraging sign for investors.
Michael, it's great to have you with us here at Bloomberg's Michael McKee on a special edition of Balance of Power live from Milwaukee. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we keep our eyes on Fiserv Forum, where day one of the RNC is happening just a couple of blocks from where we're sitting here at Bloomberg TV and radio in the field, and we assemble our political panel at this important moment. Rick Davis is with us right now, Stone Court Capital partner, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's great to have both of you with us here. We're waiting on an announcement for a running mate. The clock is ticking here. Rick, what's happening behind closed doors right now? Because obviously Donald Trump knows who this is. What is the campaign doing to prepare this unveiling?
Yeah, right now, part of what's happening is that the would-be vice president is meeting his team. There's a whole staff that's been built to take him or her from this venue onto a next 3 months of campaigning. And so it's not without its resources and whatnot. And then there's this last minute going through the speeches and making sure they're fine-tuned. They're going to be spending a little bit of time when the delegates aren't in the hall to go and do their walkthroughs to see the stage for the first time. It's probably one of the things Donald Trump will do today, maybe right now. And so there's like administrative things, but by and large, there isn't much politics being done other than, the speeches, but they're also designing these moments, right? The thing you remember from the conventions are one or two emotional moments, when the president walks in and sees the crowd for the first time, or the president and first lady, or, the candidate and his spouse, have some kind of gesture or something that's said at the stage. So that's what the organizers of this convention are trying to do, is figure out what's our moment going to be tonight. And of course, if Donald Trump shows up, that's a ready-made moment.
Well, absolutely. And it does seem that the integrity of the moment with which we all find out who the vice presidential pick actually is, to this point, has been preserved. It hasn't leaked out. We're all still laying in wait. And Rick, earlier in the program, you were bringing up the idea that it could be someone like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, even though we don't understand him to be on the short list at this time. We're looking at instead Burgum, Rubio, J.D. Vance. And I wonder about the state of Virginia, Jeannie, as we just got new New York Times Siena polling today. Looks just at two states, Pennsylvania, Biden's home state, and where the shooting happened this weekend, and Virginia. And we should advise our listeners and viewers, this poll did happen prior to the shooting, so we have to have that caveat in there. But it shows Trump leading in Pennsylvania. And in Virginia, Biden is only ahead by 3 points, 48 to 45, within the margin of error. So would someone like Glenn Youngkin be a smart pick for Trump? Could he actually turn Virginia red again?
He could. I mean, it is fascinating. I was just looking at this poll. I mean, the idea that Joe Biden is losing at this point, according to this poll, we have to say Pennsylvania, his home state, and then next door nearby, Virginia, which Democrats, of course, it is really, I think, in my mind, a must win for Democrats. So should that go red, that is a huge problem for the Democrats. And so that does make Glenn Youngkin an attractive, appealing vice presidential presidential candidate. I'm also curious, does the shooting over the weekend change Donald Trump's mind? I mean, all things being equal, if that had never happened, perhaps he had made his choice and stuck with it. But do you move away from somebody like J.D. Vance with a much tougher rhetoric to somebody like a Glenn Youngkin or a Doug Burgum, who have this sort of less rhetorical, strong statements that they've made that may be off-putting to moderates? I also note that they have now added Nikki Haley to the lineup to speak this week. Not that she's in the running to be VP as far as we know, but that's another interesting turn. So he does keep us waiting and watching and wondering. And I think when he gets in there, whether it's tonight or later this week, it is going to be one of those moments that Rick was just talking about that we all remember, especially given the fact the entire nation is rooting for him health-wise, considering what he has just survived.
Donald Trump did an interview with the Washington Examiner in which he said he rewrote his speech. It was going to be a humdinger, he said. Rick, honestly, it's going to be a whole different speech now. It's a chance to bring the country together. I was given that chance. I don't know if you believe the words you're hearing, but he has a moment, a delicate opportunity here to seize on. How different do you think that speech will be than it might have been on Friday?
Oh, I'm suspecting it's probably substantially different. I think you can't imagine what impact just escaping death has on Donald Trump or on anybody else. You can, try to put yourself in that mind frame. But certainly the organizers of the campaign, the managers and the speechwriters and the folks who are charged with getting the most bump out of this convention as they can, they haven't missed that point. And the last thing they want is a divisive political speech where Donald Trump goes up to the podium and eviscerates Joe Biden. And so no doubt everyone's aligned on this. Donald Trump probably feels this way. The campaign's going to want to see something different. And so it's not just Donald Trump's speech. Whoever has been crafting the vice president's speech is going to be having to echo that. It may change the lineup of who introduces the vice presidential candidate. Currently, we had Donald Trump Jr., another pit bull of the Republican Party. I wouldn't be surprised to see a change made there. So I think you're going to see a kinder, gentler Republican convention moving out. No, nonetheless political, but definitely tonally different.
Well, and what goes for Republicans also probably goes for Joe Biden as his campaign, at least in rethinking your tone and the way in which you message, be it a threat to democracy or anything else. And I would point out that while we await to hear Donald Trump speak at the convention later this week, we will hear more from Joe Biden this evening as he sits down for an interview on NBC with Lester Holt after hearing from him 3 times within the last several days since the shooting, including an Oval Office address last night where he was talking about unity. Jeannie, knowing that there is going to be the split screen of the RNC and a vice presidential pick up against this interview, what is the winning message here for Joe Biden? What's he trying to do?
I thought his statement yesterday or last night was very strong. I think we're going to hear more of that. He's going to talk about uniting the country, the idea that we don't resolve our differences with guns or with violence. We do it at the ballot box. And I think it's very important that he called and spoke to Donald Trump. We have already noticed on the Republican side some modulating of rhetoric. People like Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a bit of a pit bull like Donald Trump Jr. and J.D. Vance. His tone seems to have moderated. So I don't know if we are just being Pollyannish and hopeful that the tone is moderating. We are, after all, going into a Republican convention, and any convention is about, opposition to your opponents politically. But it does seem like there is a change. And I will just say, I've noticed in Donald Trump's rhetoric in particular, this talk about a conversion, the idea that this had that impact that Rick was just talking about, and that Ronald Reagan talked about after he was shot. It changed his life and what he hoped to do and did as president. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen with Donald Trump, but that some of that and that really fascinating interview in the Washington Examiner with Selena Zito, that was fascinating. And the fact that he called her was in and of itself really a remarkable moment.
Yeah, she was at the event.
She was there with her daughter.
And I guess they had an interview set up. He felt bad that they didn't have the opportunity. It is pretty remarkable here. Does Joe Biden need to make news tonight? Or is this simply about normalizing, as Jeannie indicated, the idea of doing interviews like these?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of inappropriateness by the president sort of, horning in on the first night of the Republican convention. In years gone by, there's sort of an understanding that you sort of give the opposition party their convention.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I would be shocked if he tried to make news. I buy what Jeannie's saying, that he's just trying to remain relevant. Remember, it was only a couple of days ago we were talking about getting, the Democratic Party purging him from their ticket.
Right.
And so I think he's trying to manage the transition back to being a favorite of the Democrats. And I think certainly the White House and his campaign feel they need to have him out there showing people that he's vibrant and can handle the difficulties of a presidential campaign and the presidency. So I think that's what tonight's all about.
All right. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors in our political panel here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll be joined by former Homeland Security official Ashley Davis amid the heightened security here at the RNC in the aftermath of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump over the weekend. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.